Good morning, everybody here in person. Hello to everybody watching online. We are starting up session 6 of our look at the Apocrypha, which is our look at the Maccabees. So this week we're taking a look at First Maccabees. My hope is that we can finish up, and then we would finish up with Second Maccabees next week. And then we'd be done with the Apocrypha, and we'll start to look at the book of the Bible. So those are the sheets that you have, and now let me get you some reading sheets on First Maccabees. The reality is Maccabees is a very, very long book, and so we're not going to be reading the entire thing because we'd be here a very long time. And as I was looking at the study, a lot of it has to do with like maneuvers and like this battle happened and that sort of thing. And some of the stuff is worth knowing. Other stuff, it's just kind of, it's fluff for the sake of history fluff, which I enjoy. But for an hour Bible study or hour study on the Apocrypha, it doesn't really help ourselves as much. So I tried highlighting a lot of things in the study, and maybe I'll fill in the gaps too as we're going on. So we are looking at a time in history from about 400 BC, and really it goes all the way to about 50 or 60 BC, but we're not going to be going quite that far. What I thought I would do is I would highlight for you some things that are going on in history at this time. I did talk about this in our first lesson, but the big thing is that this is the time after Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great comes after the Jews come back from Babylon and from Persia in exile, and they are repopulating the land of Israel. I'll reference the maps here in a little bit, but Alexander lived from he was alive before the 330s, but he's going around conquering the world from about the 330s to the 320s, and then he dies of a fever after partying too much in the 320s. And so he's got this big old empire that took over Greece, Asia Minor, where the Apostle Paul does a lot of his missionary work later on, and then also the ancient East, as you have the land of Israel here on the western side by the Mediterranean Sea, but then you go into like the land of Assyria, the land of Babylon, Persia, Media. Alexander even goes all the way to what we would consider modern-day Afghanistan and to the boundaries of India, too, as we know them. So he was the great, he conquered a lot of the ancient world at that time. So when he dies, you got all this territory, and you've got all this Greek influence all over the ancient world now, and I guess he wasn't alive to divide it, but his generals divided into 4 territories, and the 2 generals that we want to focus on are 2 guys by the name of Ptolemy and Seleucus. And those 2 names are very important for us because Ptolemy actually got control of the land of Israel to start with. And then, after a civil war with his fellow general, their families were fighting, the Seleucids end up in control of Israel, which is very important for our study because the story of the Maccabees takes place during the time the Seleucids are in control of the region. The Ptolemies are still kind of around, but then the Maccabees are the ones that rise up and start to really gain control of Israel again. And then one of the Maccabees survives, his family survives, and their family line will then be around for about 100 years until the Romans come in and Julius Caesar, and those guys are running around then at that time in history. So this is 400 years of history, but we are focusing specifically on about 4 decades, from the 160s BC to 130s. I guess that's, if you include all those years, that's about 4 decades worth. So when do we turn to our sheet then? First Maccabees. How much do you know about the history of Israel during the time between the Testaments, which would be 400 BC to about, I guess they have 50 AD on here, but we could quibble with what starts or when. Most of us don't know it very well because we didn't study it in school, and not many movies or television shows have been made about the time period. This would make for good TV, what we're about to look at. It would be an excellent, stay tuned next week to see what the Maccabees do. The history of this period lays the foundation for understanding the New Testament. For example, why did the Jewish people expect a warrior Messiah like David? Who are the Pharisees, and why are they so serious about God's law? Why is the New Testament written in Greek? Remember, the people we encounter from this time were like us and those who came before them, people that wanted to worship the one true God but had to find a way to do it in a world set against them. So, without further ado, why don't we then dive into the reading? I don't have a whole lot of background on the Maccabees. You have the sheet there that gives you a little bit of background. It was written in Greek, which is one reason why maybe the people would be like, I don't know if we should include this with our Hebrew Bibles. It is pretty well recorded history as far as the events go. I think as you read First Maccabees, there's certainly a bias from the author in trying to record these guys running around saving the day as superheroes for the Jewish people. So it's a bit like propaganda too as you read it. It's like, okay, like there's certainly some favoritism going on as you're reading it, but it's still some interesting and even some inspiring history of that as well. Any questions on any of that before we start? I'm going to grab my coffee quick, and then we can get started on chapter 1 there. So this is giving us the problem for this family. The family led by a guy named Mattathias. They're known as the Hasmoneans because Mattathias, is like great-great-grandfather, was a guy by the name of Asmoneus. And so sometimes you hear this family referenced as the Hasmoneans. Okay, so Alexander the Great. After Alexander, son of Philip the Macedonian, who came from the land of Kittim, had defeated King Darius of the Persians and the Medes, he succeeded him as king. He fought many battles, conquered strongholds, put to death the kings of the earth. He advanced to the ends of the earth and plundered many nations. When the earth became quiet before him, he was exalted and his heart was lifted up. He gathered a very strong army and ruled over countries, nations, and princes, and they became tributary to him. After this, he fell sick and perceived that he was dying. So he summoned his most honored officers who had been brought up with him from youth and divided his kingdom among them while he was still alive. And after Alexander had reigned 12 years, he died. Note that this itself is a little fishy, just as I'm reading it with, trying to read it with unbiased lens. Who wrote this history? It wasn't Alexander, it was his successors. Well, of course, Alexander set things up so that we would be the ones in control. You can hear, like, of course, the guys who end up in charge will write the history in their own favor. Remember, Alexander just dies after getting sick. It's not like he had time to really plan this stuff out. He was young. He didn't need to. He wasn't planning on dying, obviously. Then his officers seized control, each in his own place, and they all put on crowns after his death, and so did their sons after them for many years, and they caused many evils on the earth. So what we're doing is we're kind of fast-forwarding to the time of the Seleucids, and we're fast-forwarding to this time around the middle of their rule in the land. Well, actually, it's at the end, the 160s, to a guy by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. He is, let's say he's the bad guy in the story. So you got a foreign ruler in charge of Israel, and he's the bad guy. From them, that's from Alexander's family guys, from the generals, came forth a sinful root, Antiochus Epiphanes, son of a king Antiochus. He had been hostage in Rome. He began to reign in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. In those days, lawless men came forth from Israel and misled many, saying, "Let us go make a covenant with the Gentiles around us. For since we separated from them, many evils have come upon us." This proposal pleased them, and some of the people eagerly went to the king. He authorized them to observe the ordinances of the Gentiles, so they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to Gentile custom, and removed the marks of circumcision and abandoned the holy covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. So in other words, Greek culture is moving in, and a gymnasium in their culture was similar to what a workout center is in our culture. It's a place where you work out, maybe you swim, maybe you go to the sauna. The difference is it was all in the nude, whereas we have clothing policies, obviously, at our workout centers today. But that was Greek culture. They did it naked. So when Antiochus saw that his kingdom was established, he determined to become king of the land of Egypt, that he might reign over both kingdoms. So he invaded Egypt with a strong force, with chariots and elephants, and with a large fleet. He engaged King Ptolemy of Egypt in battle, and Ptolemy turned and fled before him, and many were wounded and fell, and they captured the fortified cities in the land of Egypt, and he plundered the land of Egypt. So Egypt and the Ptolemies, they have this ongoing war with the Seleucids. After subduing Egypt, Antiochus returned in the 143rd year. He went up against Israel and came to Jerusalem with a strong force. He arrogantly entered the sanctuary and took the golden altar, the lampstand for the light, and all its utensils. He also took the table for the bread of the presence, the cups for drink offerings, the bowls, the golden censers, the curtain, the crowns, and all the golden decorations on the front of the temple. He stripped it all off. He took the silver and the gold and the costly vessels. He took also the hidden treasures that he found. Taking them all, he departed to his own land. And then you have some comments there about he did all these terrible things. So 2 years after I'm going to jump to verse 29. 2 years later, the king sent to the cities of Judah a chief collector of tribute, and he came to Jerusalem with a large force. Deceitfully, he spoke peaceable words to them, and they believed him. But he suddenly fell upon the city, dealt it a severe blow, and destroyed many people of Israel. He plundered the city, burned it with fire, and tore down its houses and its surrounding walls. And they took captive the women and the children, and took possession of the cattle. Then they fortified the city of David with a great strong wall and strong towers, and it became their citadel. And they stationed there a sinful people, lawless men. These strengthened their position. They stored up arms and food, and collecting the spoils of Jerusalem, they stored them there and became a great snare. And just seeing if there's anything I need to highlight in that next comment there. Basically, Seleucids come in, they take over Jerusalem. Now they're taking over the altar, and they're taking all the temple, golden vessels, all the silver out. And we're going to get to something else that they do in the temple a little later on. But then they come back, the Seleucids come back, and they pretend that they're acting nice to the Jewish people. But then they do another kind of plunder at this time. So this is supposed to create a rise in you if you're the Jewish audience. You're going, yeah, these guys aren't good. They're bad news, as you're reading this story. Verse 41 then on page 162. Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people and each should give up his own customs. All the Gentiles accepted the command of the king. Many even from Israel gladly adopted his religion, and they sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. So King Antiochus says, look, all of you have to become my people, so get rid of your customs, your religious practices, all your norms, and some of the Jewish people are now starting to go along with this. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the cities of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid whole burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offering in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and feasts, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and unclean animals. This was a big deal for the Jewish people to be told, you have to sacrifice pigs now on altars, especially in Jerusalem, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. You think of another special covenant that God gave to Abraham, a sign of the covenant, the circumcision. Now they're being told you can't do that anymore. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so they should forget the law and change all the ordinances, and whoever does not obey the commands of the king shall die. In such words, he wrote to this whole kingdom, and he appointed inspectors over all the people and commanded the cities of Judah to offer sacrifice city by city. Many of the people, everyone who forsook the law, joined them, and they did evil in the land. They drove Israel into hiding in every place of refuge that they had. And I'm just looking if there's anything I need to highlight. A lot of the same stuff where they're offering sacrifices, the people, some of them start to speak against this, and then they start to use violence against those who are going to try and hold out and stand for the right things in Judaism. Very dark time in Jewish history. If you're looking at verses 54 through 60, you get a little, or 61, you get a very graphic description of the kind of things that are going on there. Verse 62 through 64. But many in Israel stood firm and were resolved in their hearts not to eat unclean food. They chose to die rather than be defiled by food or to profane the holy covenant, and they did die. And very great wrath came upon Israel. So this is supposed to be like the setting for the story, as you're seeing the Jewish people being oppressed by a foreign nation, and the temple is in ruins, and there's actually pigs being slaughtered. How could things get so bad? And now the hero is supposed to come into the story. So this is, if you're trying to use a modern day kind of parallel, this reminds me a lot of Star Wars. You got Luke Skywalker, the Empire's ruling everything. Who's going to save the day? Well, this nobody from a farmland, and so you got a similar kind of vein here, which is why I think this could be a really good TV show as you're thinking about things. So let's answer some questions. What impact did Alexander the Great have on Israel?
Changed the language of commerce to Greek.
Yeah.
Turned the outside culture that is enveloping everything to Greek. He Greek gods became common, if not appreciated.
Yeah, or at least there was an appeal to do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that Greek language, it's specifically called a Koine Greek. That's Greek for common. That's the common tongue, so it'd be a lot like normal English today. Whereas there is such a thing as classical English. Like if you read English literature, you think Shakespeare. Um, in Greek, there was the same principle that there was common Greek, just spoken by everyday people, and then there was classical Greek. You think like the philosophers, the scholars, those guys. I did have to study both while I was training to be a pastor, just because classical Greek helps you understand common Greek a little bit better too. You get some deeper thoughts. You think like John's gospel, like the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The New Testament is written in Koine Greek, but there are sometimes deep principles in Greek that we need to have a better handle on as we read it in English. It helps anyway. You think, too, of everything being written in a common tongue, like Dan was saying. Koine Greek, if everybody can speak the common tongue all over Alexander's empire, you think of the New Testament being written in that later on, that means a lot of the ancient world is all of a sudden going to be able to read this book, or at least be able to understand it. There's one other thing with Alexander, specifically in the land of Israel, that's going to be important for this story, and it has to do with conquests. Why would that have an impact, do you think, on the culture of Israel? So this is an important thing for us in our own history.
Those who conquer, those who win, have control. And there are cultural differences in any culture that when the Romans conquered the Gauls, for instance, the Gallic culture became, to a certain extent, Roman.
So you got this like absorbing, of the culture, and that was what they were afraid of. We're going to lose our Jewish heritage, our Torah, our temple, if we let these Greeks continue to go on, which is why some of them take a stand.
In our country, you compare it to Native Americans.
Okay, that's not a bad metaphor, or an analogy, I suppose, a modern day equivalent. What I was thinking, where I was going with this, is conquests are all about violence. Alexander comes in and he's all about the sword. The Ptolemies come in, they're the same way. The Seleucids come in, and as we're seeing, they're using violence to get their way. Watch as you see the Jewish people start to fight back. What's their tool they use? Violence. So violence begets violence as you continue to go along this route of, well, let's talk about things in a peaceful way, appeal to the ruler. You don't get a lot of that here. One of the sons that we'll look at, he does go the more political tact route, but even then, he's still got a lot of blood on his hands as it goes about. The reason this becomes important is, if you look at the Roman Republic history, a lot of the reason the Roman Empire starts is because there started to be outrage and public beatings of those they disagreed with. So let's say in DC we got a congressman who we disagree with. What I'm saying is that if you disagree with him, it's okay to beat him up in public. Now we, of course, would say, no, that's not right. In cultures like this, as you start to slip down that road towards like public violence is acceptable, well, then all sorts of things are possible. And that's why when we're looking at this, you're going to see like these guys are way more willing to go to the sword than maybe we would be willing to. So it's a good lesson for us in our history. Learn how dangerous it is to get violent as a culture. I think we have a very angry culture at times, and so we got to be aware of that. All right, so number 2, who is Antiochus IV Epiphanes? What did he want to do in Israel? Well, he's a Seleucid ruler, and what are some of the things he's trying to do?
Make the culture more like his own.
So yeah, he wants to make it all Greek, really, in the end. What about religion?
Squash the Jewish religion and make it
And I suppose if we were to give him some credit, it wasn't just the Jewish religion, it was all the religions. But specifically for our story, that's very important for us to know, is he wants there to be a common religion. Um, I mean, how often do we hear appeals for that? Like, why can't we all just be the same? The coexist idea. Well, there's a couple commercials that I could think of that it's like, let's have peace, pass it on sort of thing. And one of the commercials was like of a Jewish rabbi, a priest, and a Muslim leader. And they were like holding hands and, very happy with one another. And I remember a pastor once saying that would never happen because they disagree so fundamentally that if they are truly, passionate about their religion, they will never agree with one another. And so like this idea that we can all just put aside our differences that's fundamentally flawed.
Just the thought, difference in conquering nations. The Greeks seem to want everybody to do their religion. They didn't promote, the Persian religion.
This is true.
The Romans seemed, another 200 gods, no big deal. Thinking of Corinth, where there was something like 120 temples.
Or Ephesus,
yeah. Emperors.
Mm-hmm.
Roman, Egyptians was very much Egyptian. They didn't allow other religions.
Yeah, it was very normal in other ancient cultures outside of Judaism to be, let's take your gods and let's assimilate them. Let's bring them into our pantheon. So then you got Zeus alongside other gods, so that Zeus is still in charge. You can bring in your other gods, but he's the boss. There was one passage, and I'm looking for it, that is very important for us to have in mind, is that, I can't find it for some reason. The king wants them to worship him. He's kind of trying to take the place of Zeus, and he wants to be the sort of figure that I am the great divine leader for all of you, which we see that extend to the Roman emperors later on. But that's not exclusive to these guys. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar, right? That this was a very common thing in the ancient world. And so this is not exactly a new thing that the Jewish people have had to deal with, but it's just something that we want to keep in mind. Go ahead. Yeah, I suppose. What two distinguishing features of Judaism did Antiochus make punishable by the death penalty? There were two very specific ones. The first one was, you can't do what anymore? So you can't circumcise, that's a big one. And having that gymnasium in mind, if they're going and the Jews are starting to participate in this, it's going to be obvious who the Jewish people are and who aren't, because of the circumcision aspect. Their identity would be obvious, and so they could punish them more easily. What was the other thing that they had to get rid of? Verse 49. I suppose a lot of it's all under one category, but verse 49 is specifically. Carolyn, do you see it?
Forget the law.
Yeah. Take that Moses law that you got, get rid of it. Which would make it easier then for him to create his own system, because you don't have a system anymore. It's like take the Torah and get rid of it. Okay, so for the passionate Jewish people who want to remain faithful to the Lord, this is a problem, a huge problem. Note in verse 54 that there was a desolating sacrilege upon the altar of the whole burnt offering in Jerusalem. This is when the desolation that causes abomination occurs that is predicted in Daniel. In Daniel 11, verse 31, there is a prophecy that says this is going to happen, that there's going to be something that happens in Jerusalem that you're going to consider an abomination. And we even had that word in our translation here in verse 48. They make themselves abominable by everything. The Lord predicted that this was going to happen, that there was going to be an offering of an unclean animal. It was most likely in this story. This was the pig being offered in the altar of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. Now, the Greek word that we have for abomination or sacrilege often refers also to a terrible smell. So you think of a pig being offered in Jerusalem, the people who were used to certain sacrifices and what they smelled like, now you're smelling something else. This was really offensive. You think of senses to the nose for them. I was talking with Lana about this, like, I wonder if it, not to be crass, it smelled like cooking bacon or, cooking ham, like what we would think today. Most likely it wasn't that because, if it's the whole pig that's being offered, I mean, there's lots of other scents that go with that. But for us, this is a very foreign idea that there could be something so offensive, such as smell, that was all of a sudden attacking the people in the way that they were used to worshiping. So this was a big deal for the people that, number one, the animals there, but the smell. This is terrible that God's house smells like that. Contrasted. Also then in the Bible we have the description of pleasing aromas to the Lord. This is directly contrary to that. So again, we're putting layer upon layer of outrage for the Jewish people as they're listening to these things. They're seeing them happen. They're smelling in God's temple. They are mad. Those who have survived. And that leads us in then to our family that's going to save the day. Mattathias and his sons, the Maccabees. Any questions on that before we go on? So, in the first part of the story, we just have an intro to the family, and Mattathias, the dad of the family, the father, he kind of laments, these are terrible things going on in verses 7 through 13. What I want to do is I just want to name the sons that are named in the first 5 verses. You got John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan. Those 5 sons are there. They are part of the entire story of the Maccabees, first Maccabees and second Maccabees. What we're going to do as we go through the first chapter and as we kind of bounce around throughout the story is, unfortunately, we're going to have to X some of them out. Because as the story goes on, one by one, another one bites the dust. They keep on dying off. One of them survives, and that leads then to the Hasmonean dynasty, which I mentioned earlier, which then connects us to the Romans. So this is all connected in history then as we go through this next part. So I'm going to pick up then at verse 14. Matthias and his sons rent their clothes, they ripped them, put on sackcloth, and mourned greatly because of everything that's going on in Jerusalem with these Greek people. Then the king's officers who were enforcing the apostasy came to the city of Modine to make them offer sacrifices. So Modine is where these guys live. They moved from Jerusalem and they settled in this city, Modine, there is a map that has it in this book. I don't have it in front of me, but I will look that up at some point. So the king's officers come to make them offer a sacrifice. Many from Israel came to them, and Mattathias and his sons were assembled. Then the king's officers spoke to Mattathias as follows. You are a leader, honored and great in the city, and supported by sons and brothers. Now be the first to come and do what the king commands, as all the Gentiles and the men of Judah, and those that are left in Jerusalem have done. Then you and your sons will be numbered among the friends of the king, and you and your sons will be honored with silver and gold and many gifts. So offer a sacrifice and make the king happy, because everyone else in Jerusalem is doing it too, which is also not true because we just heard about how a bunch of them are rebelling and getting killed. But Mattathias answered and said in a loud voice, even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him and have chosen to do his commandments, departing each one from the religion of his fathers, yet I and my sons and my brothers will live by the covenant of our fathers. Far be it from us to desert the law and the ordinances. We will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right hand or to the left. This is their 3 men in the fiery furnace, Daniel moment. Like, no, we're going to stand for what's right. When he had finished speaking these words, the Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifices upon the altar in Modine according to the king's command. So imagine this. Mattathias and his sons, they say, no, a different Jew that they might know comes up to the altar and he's going to do the sacrifice instead because Mattathias said no. When Mattathias saw it, he burned with zeal and his heart was stirred. He gave vent to righteous anger and he ran and slaughtered him upon the altar. So this Jew who's coming up to offer the sacrifice, Mattathias takes matters into his own hands and kills him because he tries to offer the sacrifice instead. At the same time, he killed the king's officer who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. Thus he burned with zeal for the law, as Phinehas did against Zimri, son of Salom. And maybe we can tackle that question right away. And number 5 on our sheet, what is the story behind Phinehas and Zimri mentioned in 1 Maccabees 2, verse 26? Does anybody know what that's in reference to? It's Numbers 25. This is one of those many stories that we have of the people while they're not quite in the land of Canaan yet. It's It's an example of zeal and honor for the Lord. And this is in the Bible. Anybody remember? We don't often go through this one in Sunday school because it's rather graphic, extreme, let's say. Ruth, you got it there? You don't have to read the whole thing, but I don't know if you can give a summary or a highlight. Otherwise, I can too. I want to give you the chance. So there are some women in the story. Do you see who the women are, Ruth? Yeah, they're Moabite women. So the people of Israel are getting introduced to Moabite women, and some of the Israelite men are becoming interested in them. Hey, we could get some wives from them. What ends up happening is what's that? Go ahead. Do you want to read it?
Well, it says, behold, one of the people of Israel came down and brought a Midianite woman to his family in the sight of Moses, in the sight of the whole congregation. When Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw it, he rose and left the congregation and took a spear in his hand, went after the man of Israel into the inner room and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman, through her body. Thus the plague was stayed from the people of Israel.
And because they were corrupting themselves with these Moabite women and starting to turn away from God, God put a plague among the people. And so they're figuring out, okay, something's wrong. And now we have this man with this Moabite woman, and Aaron's grandson takes a spear and skewers both of them. And the people look at this and they go, yay! The plague is over. We did the right thing finally. This is supposed to be a reference then in Maccabees to that episode. What Mattathias is doing is the same thing as what Phinehas was doing. Righteous anger was the phrase that was used there. So the purpose then what we want is, see what Mattathias is like, his faith on fire, what it looks like for the Lord. And we're supposed to, as the audience, go, yeah, go get those Gentiles. Okay, let's keep going then. Mattathias cried out with a loud voice, saying, let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me. And he and his sons fled to the hills and left all that they had in the city. So they go into hiding. And then many men who were seeking righteousness and justice went down to the wilderness to dwell there. They, their sons, their wives, and their cattle, because evils pressed heavily upon them. And it was reported to the king's officers and to the troops in Jerusalem, the city of David, that men who had rejected the king's command had gone down to hiding places in the wilderness. Many pursued them, and overtaking them, they encamped opposite and prepared for battle against them on the Sabbath day, because those guys, they can't fight on the Sabbath because they're Jewish. And they said to them, enough of this, come out and do what the king commands and you will live. But they said, we will not come out, nor will we do what the king commands, and so profane the Sabbath day. Then the enemies hastened to attack them, but they did not answer them or hurl a stone at them or block up their hiding places, for they said, let us all die in our innocence, heaven and earth, just testify for us that you are killing us unjustly. So they attacked them on the Sabbath day, and they died with their wives and children and cattle to the number of 1,000 persons. So these people who went out to the wilderness to join Mattathias and his sons are now massacred because they can't fight back on the Sabbath day. Mattathias and his friends and his sons, though, aren't with those people who died. They mourn for them deeply, verse 39. And verse 40, and each said to his neighbor, if we all do as our brothers have done and refuse to fight with the Gentiles for our lives and our ordinances, they will quickly destroy us from the earth. So they made the decision that day, let us fight against every man who comes to attack us on the Sabbath day. Let us all not die as our brothers died in their hiding places. So for some reason they're thinking, well, now it's okay for us to fight back on the Sabbath day. Okay, I suppose change of thought there, as they're approaching the Sabbath. And they were united with them a company of Hazadeans, mighty warriors of Israel, everyone who offered himself willingly for the law, and all who became fugitives to escape their troubles joined them and reinforced them. They organized an army and struck down sinners in their anger and lawless men in their wrath. The survivors fled to the Gentiles for safety. And Mattathias and his friends went about and tore down the altars. They forcibly circumcised all the uncircumcised boys that they found within the borders of Israel, and they hunted down the arrogant men, and the work prospered in their hands. They rescued the law out of the hands of the Gentiles and kings, and they never let the sinner gain the upper hand. So if you think about a principle of history, usually when you have an extreme, Antiochus trying to enforce Greek customs and religion on the people, you have a reaction. You have people pushing back who don't want that, and this is the reaction. And this is Mattathias and his sons revolting against the rebelling. And so Mattathias, he has his last words here. And basically, long story short, it's remember our history and kill everybody who fights back against us. It's rebel, don't give up. And then verse 69, then he blessed them and was gathered to his fathers. He died in the 146th year and was buried in the tomb of his fathers at Modine. And all Israel mourned for him with great lamentation. So Mattathias, he stands up for what is right, and then he dies. Oh, the people, this is their hero, and he's gone. Now they have his son. So if we were to go through verses 49 through 70 of chapter 2, we'd be looking at Mattathias' last words. There's some biblical doctrine missing. He keeps talking to them about this, well, do what's right, continue to fight, and there's no mention of the resurrection. No mention of don't worry in the end because God's going to make it all work out for us in the end in eternity. There's no talk about eternity. Mattathias, you think of this idea of righteous anger. Is he saying the right thing to his sons? Just get them. Go get them, boys. Does God ever say that to us? This take matters into your own hands sort of thing. You'd have a hard time proving it anyway. There is such a thing as you're thinking of military action, a good thing for a Christian to do to defend himself. There is such a thing as a righteous war. The problem is this an example of where the people are supposed to fight back, or are they supposed to trust in the Lord? We have very little talk about spiritual things going on here. I suppose you got talk about the idolatry, the Greek customs being forced on the people, but you don't have a whole lot of talk of trust in the Lord. Look to him, look to the word. It's more about action. It's more about fighting back, which is a different kind of book. Yeah, I don't know if I have anything else on that. Let's go on to number 7 then. Compare Mattathias' admonition to pay back the Gentiles in full. That was right before where we picked up in 69. With Jesus' command to forgive our enemies in Matthew 5. Which comes more naturally to us? To pay back our enemies in full or to forgive our enemies? Yeah. Eye for an eye idea, right? Saw a phrase, God forgives, humans get even. That's interesting as you're looking at this. You're thinking, too, about the people's expectations of what a Messiah is supposed to do. Well, if you're in their shoes, what is a Messiah going to do? Save the day! He's going to come and he's going to fix everything that we've got going wrong in our world right now. Is it any surprise that the disciples thought that way as you're looking at the history already? This is the backdrop for, Jesus and his day, for the disciples growing up. This is their culture. They're used to this kind of history. And we're going to get more into it as we go on here, too. We ready to go on? Let's go on to one of the first sons, a guy by the name of Judas Maccabeus. Judas is called Maccabeus because that means the hammer. He's a guy who's going to fight. He's this guy who's going to really stick it to those people who are not on our side. And this is where we have the story of Hanukkah. So I'm going to kind of highlight here because this is one of the sections in which we could spend a lot of time on. Judas is, if you're thinking of the sons, like what their lineup is, like who's the tough guy? Judas is the guy who's the tough guy. He's the guy who's got the weaponry. He's the guy who's going to go out and he's going to fight. He's the guy who really takes Dad's spirit and runs with it, which is why we have the book called Maccabees, because they're taking after his title there, his nickname. So Judas goes and he goes around, he goes on fighting. He goes on fighting against Antiochus and against those who are going to stand in his way. You got lots of talk about Greek guys and them trying to scheme and get back at Judas and his brothers. I'm trying to remember if this is the moment. None of the brothers have died yet, but Mattathias has. So Mattathias is gone at this point. Now we got 5 brothers left running things for the people. There's a battle at Emmaus in chapter 4. There's more talk about a campaign. And Judas is experiencing some success. And what ends up happening is they get into Judea and they end up taking back the temple. So I'm getting distracted by someone here. They get to Jerusalem and they end up recapturing part of the city. I don't believe it's the entire city, but it is part of it. This is one of the challenges with this study with Maccabees is there's a lot of moving parts to it. But I want to go on to verses 36 through 59. You see that marked on your sheet there, page 169? So Judah says to his brothers, "Behold, our enemies are crushed. Let us go up to cleanse the sanctuary and dedicate it." So all the army assembled, and they went up to Mount Zion, and they saw the sanctuary desolate, the altar profaned, and the gates burned. In the courts they saw bushes sprung up as in a thicket or as one on one of the mountains, and they also saw the chambers of the priests in ruins. And they rent their clothes and mourned with great lamentation, and sprinkled themselves with ashes. They fell face down on the ground and sounded the signal on the trumpets and cried out to heaven. Then Judas detailed men to fight against those in the citadel until he had cleansed the sanctuary. So their goal is to fix the temple so that they can make it good again for God's people. And so he chose blameless priests devoted to the law, and they cleansed the sanctuary and removed the defiled stones to an unclean place. They deliberated what to do about the altar of the whole burnt offering, which had been profaned, and they thought about it best to tear it down, lest it bring reproach upon them, for the Gentiles had defiled it. So they tore down the altar and stored the stones in a convenient place on the temple hill, until there should come a prophet to tell what to do with them. Then they took whole stones as the law directs and built a new altar like the former one. They also rebuilt the sanctuary and the interior of the temple and consecrated the courts. They made new holy vessels, brought the lampstand. I'm going to just jump through it. Verse 50, they burnt incense on the altar and lighted the lamps on the lampstand and gave light in the temple. Okay? They placed the bread on the table and they hung up the curtains thus, and they began to finish all the work they had undertaken. Then they have a celebration in which they celebrate that the temple is rededicated. And jumping into verse 58 on page 170, there was a very great gladness among the people, and the reproach of the Gentiles was removed. Then Judas and his brothers and all the assembly of Israel determined that every year at that season the days of dedication of the altar should be observed with gladness and joy for 8 days, beginning with the 25th day of the month of Kislev. 8 days. Why does that sound familiar? This is where Hanukkah comes from. Now, this is not part of the story, but the tradition among the Jewish people is that for those 8 days, they had only found one sealed jar. It hadn't been opened. It was unopened. A jar of olive oil. And it was found in the temple after the Gentiles had come in and desecrated everything. But this jar was undefiled because it was still sealed. That jar was only supposed to last one night. Instead, it lasted 8 days, which is a story that is associated with Hanukkah, the oil that lasted for 8 days when it was only supposed to last one. Supposedly, that was a miracle that occurred. That's not in this story, but that is part of the story of Hanukkah, and sometimes you see that mentioned to this day. So now you have an understanding of where Hanukkah comes from. It's a dedication of the temple. This is Hanukkah means festival of lights, which I'm guessing most of us know that at this point, but you think of like the menorah candle, think of the lights idea. Let's see here. Where do I want to jump to next? Let's go to chapter 5, page 172. We're going to read through 55 through 62. Just looking to make sure none of the other brothers have been killed at this point. A lot of other fighting goes on. They come back to Jerusalem. I want to read verse 53. You see it circled there. Judas kept rallying the stragglers and encouraging the people all the way till he came to the land of Judah. And so let's keep fighting, guys. And then let's go on. Verse 55 through 62. Now while Judas and Jonathan were in Gilead, and Simon his brother was in Galilee before Ptolemais, Joseph son of Zechariah and Azariah, the commanders of the forces, heard of their brave deeds and of the heroic war they had fought. So they said, let us also make a name for ourselves. Let us go and make war on the Gentiles around us. And they issued orders to the men of the forces that were with them, and they marched against Jamnia area. Is Jamnia a person? I can't remember if it's... Let's go on. And Gorgas, and his men came out of the city to meet them in battle. Then Joseph and Azariah were routed and were pursued at the borders of Judea. As many as 2,000 of the people of Israel fell that day. Thus the people suffered a great rout, because thinking to do a brave deed, they did not listen to Judas and his brothers. But they did not belong to the family of those men through whom deliverance was given to Israel. This is important because, looking at number 9, the book idealizes the Maccabean family and paints a picture of Judas Maccabeus as faithful and courageous and shrewd. In 5:55 through 62, what we just read, what does the author of this book point to as the cause of the victory for the Israelites? So I guess, why did the people fail? Yeah, because they didn't listen to Judas. So in other words, what do we have to do to win? Listen to Judas and his brothers, right? The comment, I suppose it's kind of implied in verse 62. Deliverance was given through these men. God appointed this family, so why aren't we listening to them? This is why I think of it more as propaganda. Because if you're reading this as a Jewish person, who are you going to root for? Well, you're going to root for the family, the ones who are in charge, the guys who are ruling, the ancestors of the Hasmoneans. You're supposed to have sympathy then for these guys, like, yeah, you should have listened to them. Supports the claim that the Maccabees and their descendants are the only rightful rulers and high priests in Judea. That becomes important for the surviving son and his descendants, who make up the kings then, or the priests that lead up to the Romans coming in. Because they're telling the people, well, our family are the only ones, our family is the only family that should have rulers for you anymore. Convenient, eh, that you got a story to support that. Verse 53, I read that before. How does the author's comment in verse 53 reflect the promise of Mattathias given years earlier? So what did Mattathias tell his sons to keep doing? Yeah, keep fighting. And what is Judas telling them that they need to keep doing? Hey, keep fighting, guys. So they're taking that crusade that Mattathias gave to his sons, and they're running with it, and they're not going to stop it. Okay. Think about this zeal for the law idea. You think about zeal for the law for the Jewish people in the Bible, or zeal for the law in the New Testament, zeal for the law for us as Christians. What is the goal in being zealous for God's law?
It points us to the Savior.
Right. Yeah, we want to go to God. We want to understand our own depravity, but then also trust in God's message of deliverance. Note what it's resulting in for the Maccabees. We're not hearing a whole lot about God's name being glorified, but whose name is being glorified instead? There's the Maccabees. And so, of course, the zeal for the law results in glory for them. I want you to think about Paul in the New Testament. Isn't he very similar at first when he starts before Jesus appears to him on the road to Damascus? He wants to destroy God's enemies, and he takes the sword to the Christian people before the Lord turns him around. I do wonder what Paul would have to say about the Maccabee story in light of his route that he takes for faith. The Lord turns him around, and he has perspective then, and he could look at that and go, yeah, that wasn't zeal for the law. That was zeal for the way we wanted things to go. Now, granted, the Maccabees, they lived in a hard time. Any of us would we point the finger at them and say, they shouldn't have fought back? And that's a hard thing to say, because they were going through so much grief and so much, they were under pressure, to turn their back on the Lord. But we're not seeing a whole lot of let's go to God and let's get advice from him. Okay? So as we go through, you do have the last days of Antiochus, the bad guy. You have a couple more battles going on there. You do have at the end of, it's not at the end, it's in the middle of chapter 6, one of the brothers, Eleazar, he's known by the name of Avaron. He is one of the ones that ends up giving his life in a battle that involves elephants, believe it or not. So elephants take down Eleazar. So we got one of the brothers is now dead. Okay? The king's army, the king who succeeds Antiochus, they send some soldiers up to Jerusalem. They take over Mount Zion again, even after Hanukkah has already occurred. And so we have the comment in verse 54 of chapter 6. Few men were left in the sanctuary because famine had prevailed over the rest, and they had been scattered each to his own place. So you got things getting from bad to worse again. I'm just looking at my notes here. You do have more expeditions of a guy from the Seleucid family who is now coming from Rome. And now we start to have the Romans start to get interested in things. The Romans come along and they send this pretender to the throne who says he has a claim to fight against the guy who's making bad for the Jewish people. There's a lot of civil war and stuff going on here, and the Romans are starting to meddle in it and say, well, who's the guy that we want to support? They end up turning their back on the guy that they initially want to go with. But in chapter 8, Judas is going around and he's still creating problems for their enemies. And Judas hears about the fame of the Romans. And so he sends a couple of their friends to pledge friendship with the Romans and to create an alliance with the Roman Senate. And so this is where the Jewish people reach out to the Romans and say, hey, you want to come and help us out with our problems? Big mistake, because then the Romans never leave. Now, granted, at first, they're just agreeing to, a treaty of sorts to say, well, we'll fight your enemies, you scratch our back, we'll scratch yours, sort of thing. And the alliance is made, but what ends up happening then in chapter 9 is we have the last battle of Judas, where Judas Maccabeus dies. I'm going to jump there to chapter 9. You do have that printed out for you. Chapter 9, I'm going to go to page 179, verses 11 through 18. Sorry, I'm jumping around here a lot. Then the army of Maccabees, that's one of the generals that's supposed to fight against them, marched out from the camp and took its stand for the encounter. The cavalry was divided into two companies, and the slingers and the archers went ahead of the army, as did all the chief warriors. Maccabees was on the right wing, flanked by the two companies. We got a lot of details there. The men of Judas also blew their trumpets. The earth was shaken by the noise of the armies, and the battle raged from morning till evening. So you're supposed to go, this is epic, the great fight. This is why, Hollywood should have a field day with this. Judas saw that Maccabees and the strength of his army were on the right, and that all the stout-hearted men went with him, and they crushed the right wing, and he pursued them as far as Mount Azotus. When those on the left wing saw that the right wing was crushed, they turned and followed close behind Judas and his men. The battle became desperate, and many on both sides were wounded and fell. Judas also fell, and the rest fled. So this was the fall of Judas. You're supposed to go, no! This is, the warrior. They lose their hero. And then Jonathan and Simon, the brothers, they end up taking Judas's body and burying it. Let's answer this question then, based on those verses. Why does Judas fight rather than take the advice of his commanders? Look at verse 10. I know you're kind of going to be flipping between 178 and 179 just because it carries over. He says, far be it from us to do such a thing as to flee for them. If our time has come, let us die bravely for our brothers, and leave no cause to question our honor. So in other words, we can't be a coward. No, let's fight until the end. So you're supposed to be going, that's how I want to go out. Yeah. So why doesn't he fight rather than take the advice of his commanders, which is surrender, live for the people? Well, he doesn't want to look like a coward. Now let's ask this question. Was it wise for Judas to do this? Go the martyr's route. I suppose it's easier in hindsight for us to answer. And why was it politically good?
Because it would reset the Jews who were rebelling.
Okay. So it would have been good for him to surrender or good for him to fight? To fight.
If surrender, that probably would have been the end of most of the rebellion. Because if Judas has to surrender, what hope do we have?
Right, and it honors dad, like the keep on fighting principle. We're not going to turn our back on the mission like you're saying.
Somehow this reminds me of Masada.
Yeah, there's a similar kind of spirit in that fight too. question of would they have fared better if he had just lived and created, a political situation, which one of his brothers does eventually. Yeah, it is a good question, but it's one of those things in history we'll never know because he didn't go that route. He ended up dying and taking a stand because he didn't want to look like a coward. Let's go down then to chapters 9 through 12. I'm going to bounce around with some of this. So Jonathan, brother Jonathan, there's 3 brothers left. You got John, Simon, and Jonathan. Jonathan kind of takes up the mantle of Judas, and he is now the guy in charge. Jonathan is a little bit more sneaky, though. He starts off fighting, and he ends up creating situations in which one of the other brothers actually dies. So he attacks this group of people in the mountains, and then in verses 32 through right around 36, a group of other guys grab John, and they end up killing him because Jonathan made them mad. Involved a wedding party. Why does Judas then attack them again? Well, because his brother, John, was killed by them in verse 36. So you got a lot of this, well, I'm going to attack you. Well, we're going to take your brother and kill him. Well, now I'm going to kill you instead. So it's a lot of back and forth going on, but now another one of the brothers is gone. So now, if you're keeping track at home, Simon and Jonathan are the only 2 left of Mattathias' sons. The war goes on between Jonathan and that guy who killed Judas, was mentioned earlier, Maccabees. It goes on for a while, but then the war eventually ends because, number 13, I'll just give you the answer for this. They create a peace treaty. Maccabees agrees to leave the country, but he also executes a whole bunch of people just to prove that he's got he's still tough. There are a lot of the Jewish Greek people who live in Jerusalem, and so Jonathan isn't exactly sad about seeing Greek people killed, but it's a bloody thing is the point. It's a very bloody treaty. Jonathan basically gets set up to be the high priest and the political ruler then of the Jewish people. So convenient that it works out for Jonathan. He decides, well, let's try to figure this out a different way. Oh, I'm the high priest? How did that happen? What ends up happening is that the guy who sends Maccabees is one of the Seleucids. This king then is the one who makes Jonathan a high priest. So wrap your heads around this. This is an important point. A foreign Gentile king is appointing a high priest in Jerusalem. If you're a Jewish person, why would that rub you the wrong way?
Gentile.
Okay, so a Gentile's in charge, really, appointing who's going to be priest. Who also is supposed to be the priest?
Levites.
Yeah, one of the Levites. We're kind of skirting that whole system that God had set up. And this is not going according to the way that the Lord had set up the system. So this is also supposed to bother us because as you're looking at the system, well, this is just politics that's taking over people. This isn't exactly a better situation, so to speak. So as we go on throughout the story, a lot of things happen, and Jonathan's claim to fame then in chapter 12 is that he sets up alliances with Rome and Sparta. Because they're, the powerhouses of the ancient world at this time. Rome had already kind of been involved with the situation, but point being, they're starting to really create treaties with other foreign powers, which they'd also been warned about doing in the Old Testament. So, number 15 on our sheet, if Judas was an excellent military commander, what was Jonathan's claim to fame? Well, he's a politician. He's a really good politician. Now, as we go then through the rest of the chapters, what ends up happening in chapter 12 is Jonathan gets captured and he's killed. Even though he maneuvers politically, he's kind of like a fox and he's really good at it, well, he ends up dying anyway. Oh, and look at that. There's one guy left. Well, as history would take its ironic course, Simon decides to set up his family as the only rightful rulers of the people then from this point on. So what did Simon accomplish then as the years go on? Well, he makes the homeland secure by conquering parts of the region. And so he kicks out a lot of the enemies that they had been fighting. He brings the people back together. He unites them in a Jewish way. And then he also reaffirms the bonds that his brother had just made with Rome and Sparta. This is now where we are in history. For about 70 years, 7 decades, Simon's family is going to be the rulers of the area, and the Romans are going to be kind of hovering around in the region for a while, until the end of the dynasty in the 60s, when the Romans say, all right, we're done with this, and we're just going to take over. And then that's when you have the Julius Caesar, you got Caesar Augustus rising up at the end of this century, and then you've got governors in the land of Judea, like Pontius Pilate. This is why things are set up the way they are later on, because Simon's son, a guy by the name of John Hyrcanus, is the first in a line of priests who are really the political rulers for the area. Does anybody know the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls? 1940s, there was a shepherd walking around the kind of the wastelands of Jerusalem, kind of outside the city, and he's throwing rocks. And he throws a rock into a cave, and he hears a shattering. He's like, oh, like I'm out in the wilderness, and I hear a jar shatter. And so he goes looking, and he finds a whole bunch of jars with scrolls in them. Because the scrolls had been taken out of Jerusalem during this time in history. I think I'm getting my history right. Please don't quote me on this if you're watching online. There had been some Jewish people who weren't happy with John and his family and said they weren't real high priests. And so they go out and they live in the wilderness and they take some of the literature with them and they hide it in the scrolls or in this caves, and they stayed there until the 1900s. When, as dumb luck would have it, we would discover them with a kid throwing a rock. It's a really fascinating story, because then you look at like some of the scrolls. There's a scroll of the prophet Isaiah. You compare it then to the copies we did have from back then. They're pretty much exactly the same. So you think like, oh, is our book of Isaiah, is our Bible good for this day? Yeah, absolutely. That's just an interesting story from this time in history. All right. So number 17, what honors did the people bestow upon Simon in return? Well, he's the high priest forever, which, I mean, he dies eventually. He's the military and political leader too. This is his dynasty, the Hasmonean dynasty. So how does he die? Well, his son-in-law murders him, and 2 of his other 3 sons, which is why John is the only one left. John Hyrcanus, he's the only one left standing at the end. Simon and his 2 sons are invited to a banquet in their honor, and their enemies murder them while they're eating. Yep. Today was one of the Ptolemies, actually, I believe. They keep coming back into this. All right, so we're starting to wrap up here. Let's answer the last question. I'm sorry for bouncing around. There's a lot of reading into this, and I'm just trying to give us kind of a summary version of the story. Please feel free to read it on your own time. There's a lot of details, just numbers and stuff of the soldiers, various tactics that they use. But the big thing is that Mattathias and his sons, they fight for the sake of the Jewish people. Number 19, during his public ministry, Jesus kept his messianic identity a secret. He revealed himself to his disciples and a few Samaritans. How does 1 Maccabees help explain his reluctance to reveal himself openly? So I think this backdrop of history, why would Jesus hold back revealing who he is?
Afraid they try to install him as a military leader again.
You think of Peter with his sword in the Garden of Gethsemane. No wonder he was quick to the trigger. He's like, we gotta fight. Why does he think that? There's precedent. There is precedent for that kind of action. So you think about the expectations. What kind of Messiah do you want? A warrior king, a high priest?
If you're Greek or Roman, the Jews are just a pain in the ass.
Well, colorful language there.
The
Yeah.
way, and you understand why this is part of what's going on.
Right. Pain in the rear. End foreign oppression. Right. We want to look at this, look at the Jewish people in respect to the foreign powers that be, but then also for the Jewish people versus foreign nations. They want somebody who's going to kick out these other people and just establish our land. So that's the story. Now you know the story of the Maccabees. We'll talk about Second Maccabees next time. It's very similar to First Maccabees. There are slight differences with it. A couple other characters that are included too. But one thing in Second Maccabees that we'll probably, in fact, I will go out of my way to cover, is that's where the doctrine of purgatory comes from Second Maccabees. And then we have a couple of other books there. They're kind of small little prayers and songs that are associated with other parts of the Bible. But we'll see if we have time to get to them. But I guess my intention then is that next time that will be our step away finally from the Apocrypha, and we'll get back into a Bible book the following week. So any comments or questions about First Maccabees? All righty. Well, thank you everybody for bearing with me as we navigate some of those choppy waters. It is an interesting history, but I will say again, is it all 100% true? I guess I have a hard time believing every detail is true because of just the nature of propaganda and how it works. But usually there's truth in the middle somewhere. As you're saying, well, it's either this way or it's that way. Well, it's somewhere in between. There is evidence of other historians. You think of a guy like the Josephus or Greek writers or Roman history writers. They do record some of this in their histories, but not all of it. This is specifically from their point of view, from their culture. So, with that, why don't we close with a prayer? Lord, the history of your people is littered with lots of examples of admirable things and possibly some questionable things too. And so we ask for you to help us focus ultimately on those that point us to you, not necessarily conquest in the name of conquest or for the sake of family heritage or fame, but ultimately we want to focus on those stories that inspire us to go back to your word. And so help us to learn from this history, but then also to learn to just treasure this wonderful story that we have from you, that you sent us a Savior, a true Messiah that came not to liberate us from the people of this world, but ultimately to liberate us from the sin of this world and from death and from hell itself. Help us focus on that throughout Lent and throughout our Sundays in Lent, and just to continue to go back to the cross. Help us hold on tighter to Jesus as we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, fearing no evil, for you are with us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, thank you everybody here in person, and thank you anybody watching online with us too.